Art is not merely a reflection of society, it's a tool for change. Throughout history, art has been used to challenge the status quo, provoke thought, and inspire movements. In times of social and political turmoil, artists have often been at the forefront, using their work to make powerful statements. However, the role of art in social change is complex. While it has the power to bring issues to the forefront, there's also the risk of commodification, where the message is lost in the quest for commercial success. In addition, the accessibility of art is a constant challenge, often confined to galleries and theaters, limiting its reach. To truly harness the power of art for social change, it must be made accessible to a broader audience, encouraging widespread engagement and dialogue.
You may not know much, if anything, about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but you have probably heard the well-known quote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." In his early work, Rousseau argued that mankind was happiest and at its best in a state of nature, that is, before the creation of society and civilization. He saw society as artificial and corrupt, and that good people were corrupted by it. The Social Contract is perhaps the most enduring and well-known of his books, covering pretty well every aspect of man in society. However, in this book, his attitude to the condition of man in a state of nature changes. In such conditions, man is brutish and competitive by nature, and there is no law or morality. Therefore, because it is easier to survive by joining forces with others, people form societies to better fight anything that might endanger their situation. Rousseau's political philosophy has had a profound influence on later thinkers, even though, or perhaps especially because, it is open to many interpretations. But political philosophy is not everybody's cup of tea. In his own time, Rousseau was a bestseller, with novels such as The New Eloise and especially Émile, though even the latter is not free of his constant desire to improve society. It illustrates his ideas about the best form of education, which involves educating a child's emotions before their reason. This too had a profound influence on educational theorists.
Before farming was introduced into Scotland, people lived by hunting, fishing, and gathering wild foodstuffs. This way of life meant that they usually didn't settle permanently in one place, but were to an extent nomadic, moving about in search of a livelihood, perhaps returning to the same places at certain times of the year. It is believed that the islands of Orkney were known to these people, but so far only a few flint tools have been found to verify this. This is because coastal erosion has destroyed many ancient sites, and these may have contained relics of some of these earliest pioneering colonists.
Paper was first manufactured in Europe by the Spanish in the 12th century, although it had been imported since the 10th century. Around the year 1276, a mill was established at Fabriano in Italy. The town became a major centre for paper making and throughout the 14th century provided most of Europe with fine quality paper, which it has continued to produce ever since. By the 15th century, paper was also being manufactured in Germany and France, and it was not long before both countries became almost completely independent of material bought overseas. With the increasing availability of paper in Europe, the production of identical printed pictures became almost inevitable.
The spinal cord, the link between the brain and the body, is a band of nervous tissue about the thickness of your little finger that runs through the backbone. Nerve cells, called motor neurons, convey electric impulses that travel from the brain to the spinal cord, branching off at the appropriate point and passing to the various parts of the body. Similarly, sensory neurons transmit messages from organs and tissues via the spinal cord to the brain. But the spinal cord also functions without the brain having to intervene. It alone controls those actions called spinal reflexes that need to be carried out very fast in response to danger.
I want to take a quick look at how material culture, that is, the things or objects we value and use, tools, technology, etc., affects the non-material culture, our customs, behaviour, beliefs, attitudes, and so on. Now, of course, it works both ways. If you were, say, 18 years old when mobile phones became widespread, or when almost every home had a computer, you must have noticed a fairly significant change in people's attitudes and behaviour, including your own. These two technological innovations were readily accepted and considered very much a positive contribution to culture. On the other hand, there is the way in which our attitudes and beliefs have an effect on the material culture. Take, for example, genetic science. While many, if not most, people welcome the advances made in this field, from the discovery of DNA to the Genome Project and cracking the genetic code, with its promise of finding cures for diseases that have plagued mankind throughout history, many too object to the idea of cloning. This is not just because they fear, without reason, that it will mean creating a race of identical people if it gets into the wrong hands, but simply because it is, in their opinion, unnatural. It goes against everything they believe in. Similarly, there are many who object to genetically modified food, even when they are told it might be the only way to feed a rapidly growing global population.
Signs advertising business premises have been around for thousands of years and were used in ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome to attract customers. And they often used symbols to illustrate what kind of business it was. For example, bushes or branches of ivy meant the place was a tavern. Both of these, the tavern and its sign, were introduced into Britain by the Romans in the first half of the 1st century AD. In Europe in the Middle Ages, signs became more common. Then, in the 14th century, English merchants were obliged to have them outside their shops. However, the fashion was to have large swinging signs hung from a strut sticking out of the wall, and many public houses still have such signs. But so many accidents occurred, mostly involving people on horseback, that in the 17th century a law was brought in, requiring shopkeepers to mount their signs flat against the wall of the premises, where they could do no harm.
As I mentioned last week, we're going to look today at fiction writing, writing stories, and in particular at authors who have a reputation for creating characters in their books who are known as unreliable narrators. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, originally in the 19th century, it tended to simply mean that, as a reader, you just couldn't trust what the narrator of a story was telling you. This might have been because they were not giving you important information, or because they themselves, as a character in their own story, lacked some kind of personal insight. In later works of literature, this unreliability was used by authors more deliberately, with the direct intention of making a story more complicated for a reader to understand, perhaps a crime novel or a thriller. Nowadays, there's a lot more humour in unreliable narration, and it's often used to make first-person characters enjoyable to read about. So, what all that tells us as a general starting point is that this type of narration
Conducting a video conference is now a popular means of communication in the business world. This telecommunications technology allows two or more locations to communicate by simultaneous video and audio transmissions. It's designed to serve conferences or meetings in multiple locations. The advantages are obvious. No more lengthy phone calls or complex correspondence with business contacts, partners, or offices overseas. This relatively low-cost, fast, effective communication method has made significant inroads in not just a business context, but also education, medicine, and media.
If you've spent any time hitting up the giant wholesalers or other markets this holiday season, you've probably figured out that you can make a full meal out of those tasty little samples they often dish out. Which seems like a good thing for you and for your wallet. But a new study shows that these tempting little treats really do entice you to buy what you try, and maybe some other stuff like it. Researchers tracked the sales in half a dozen stores that provided samples of snacks in 4 categories: healthy, salty, frozen, or branded by a large coffee shop chain. They found that noshing while shopping convinces consumers to buy the featured product more often than does simply seeing the product displayed at the end of the aisle. They also found that repeating the sample offering multiple times translates into sustained interest in the product, and that stores that have a smaller assortment of products for sale benefit more than the warehouse-size emporia. The findings served up in the Journal of Retailing. The researchers also discovered that the effect extends beyond the product itself, such that, for example, nibbling on one brand of cookies makes you hungry for cookies in general, including those from competing brands. Which suggests that a rising tide really does lift all boats. Or, at least that a tray of free taquitos will certainly lift a lot of shoppers' spirits, and it'll keep those registers ringing well into the new year. How can you tell the difference between a French baby and a German baby? No, it's not that one is wearing a saucy little beret while the other is tucked into a tiny pair of lederhosen. Well, maybe that's part of it. But a new study in the journal Current Biology shows that the babies actually sound different because the melody of an infant's cry matches its mother tongue. We all know that babies start eavesdropping while they're still in the womb, so when they come out, they know their mother's voice. When they're older, they start to imitate the sounds they hear. Eventually they babble, and then start to speak, and then you never hear the end of it.
Hey, Mom!
But long before that first burble or coo, babies are learning the elements of language. A team of scientists recorded the cries of 60 newborns, 30 born into French-speaking families and 30 that heard German, and they found that French infants wail on a rising note, while the Germans favor a falling melody. Those patterns match the rhythms of their native languages. So next time you hear a baby cry, listen closely. He could be telling you where he's from.
Software companies are always coming up with new things. Our sociology department has a global reputation for its outstanding quality. Now, researchers are dealing with problems and finding answers.